Welcome to Rare on Air, the monthly podcast from Eurordis, Rare Diseases Europe. I am your host, Julien Poulain, and once a month, we will be exploring the challenges, experiences, and successes of people who live with a rare condition. In this episode of Rare on Air, I speak with Jane Velkovski, a 15-year-old North Macedonian rare disease advocate with spinal muscular atrophy, or SMA for short, who is currently living in Slovenia. With several years of activism already under his belt, Jane shares what inspired him to become an advocate at such a young age for people living with SMA, disabilities, and rare diseases. Jane talks to me about his earliest memories of life with SMA, the formative experiences from his childhood that shaped his perspectives, his passion for football, and the specific changes he envisions to make society more inclusive and public spaces more accessible. We hope you enjoyed this insightful conversation about accessibility, the influence of sports, and the power of youth in advocacy. So, Jane, thank you very much for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to talk with you today and to share my story and my experiences with the people.
No, thank you. We really appreciate you joining us. So, of course, you're a young advocate for people living with spinal muscular atrophy, SMA, as well as for people who live with other forms of disabilities. The first question I would like to ask you, Jane, is what are your earliest memories of life with SMA?
Well, the earliest memories of me with the disability is probably when I was a little kid, when I was in kindergarten. I remember not having a power wheelchair, and we were a couple of kids from my street. We were like similar in age, and we will all go out and play some games like hide and seek through the street and everything. And my aunt or my grandpa or my parents would always like come and push me, so I could play these games. And I remember also in kindergarten, my friends used to push me. And after that, when I went to elementary school, I got my power wheelchair. And that's when I got like my freedom of movement. And yeah, that's my earliest memories of living with SMA.
I see, that's interesting. It sounds like you were not hindered in your ability to play with other kids and have fun with family and so on.
Yeah, they've always accepted me. They didn't look at the disability, they looked at the person. And I didn't want to limit myself.
That's really positive to hear. Thanks, Jane. So for people who may not be familiar with SMA, how would you describe what exactly it is as a medical condition?
Yeah, well, SMA, it affects the muscles in your body. It makes them weaker. That's why most people with SMA can't walk. I mean, that really depends on what type of SMA you have. There are 4 types. There are type 1, type 2, type 3, and type 4. Usually type 4 people, they can walk freely. They just, over time, if they don't receive the cure, they go into a wheelchair. That also goes for type 3. I mean, if you don't receive the cure early, like you can walk from the early stages, but after that, if you don't receive the cure, like you have to use a wheelchair. Type 2, that's what the type I am. I think like you have to receive treatment when you are like a baby, so you can walk. And type 1 are the most risky type. Those are the worst types. Many of them die from birth. They don't make it far, and they need treatment. They need many resources to help them. Yeah, it really depends on when you receive the treatment. I guess if you receive it from a young age, you could have a really promising future ahead of you, and you can probably walk, and you can do just as much as anything other kids that don't have a disability can do.
I see. So that's really devastating that children die at a young age from the condition. What was your story, and what was your family's story, perhaps, towards a diagnosis? Were you diagnosed early enough?
I was diagnosed in 2009. My parents first noticed the changes when most babies start crawling and things like that. And I didn't do that. My parents took me to the doctors and they said, can you run a test? And that's when they determined that I have SMA. And back then there wasn't a cure. So and I lived my life. And thankfully, in 2017, we got it, the first cure, the first medical treatment. And first, it wasn't approved because, like I just said, I don't come from a very developed country. And first, it wasn't approved, but then we used the media to raise awareness. Then I remember that the prime minister invited me to his cabinet, me and my family, and we were there. And yeah, he said, yeah, we would approve it, absolutely. And yeah, they approved it. And finally, in 2019, after my speech in the United Nations, I came home, and that's when I first got the treatment for SMA.
Oh, wow. So that's a really impressive story of quite direct advocacy that seems to have yielded quite an immediate result. That's really impressive.
Yeah, well, I mean, it wasn't immediate, but it was more slow and steady. But people came to my help. I mean, sport people, athletes, famous people from Macedonia. They came to my side, and that's when the Prime Minister and the Ministry of Health caught wind of the situation, and they were like, yeah, we would approve it, of course. And that didn't just help me, that helped 700 kids in my country. So, yeah.
So was that the first period in which you got involved in advocating for people with SMA? Are your first memories of you and your family using the media to bring about change and bring about improvements in lives like yours? Was that more related to medical matters, trying to improve medical care for living with SMA or other disabilities? Or was it more related to disability policy and making sure that there was more inclusion in everyday life and in daily society?
The main goal was for me to get the therapy so I could live a long life and without any consequences. So we wanted to change the policies to get the treatment. And after that, we wanted to change the policies because realistically, for me, it was more important for me to get therapy. I mean, of course, I'm not just looking out for me. I'm looking out for other disabled people. But my main goal for the start was for me to get the treatment. That was my goal. The main goal was to get me therapy. And my earliest memory of advocacy, I mean, the ball started rolling, the snowball, down the hill when it was 2017. And the Super Cup, I don't know if you watch football, but the Super Cup is basically a one game between the winner of the Champions League and the winner of the Europa League, and they play each other.
Yeah.
And that was played in Skopje in Macedonia. And at the time, my parents, they were associated with the Super Cup because they have not connections, but like my aunt works in the Football Federation of Macedonia.
I see.
And as the game was going on, like one day before, me, my brother, my grandpa, and my uncle went into like a tour of the stadium, I guess.
Right, yes.
And I remember there were photos of all the players. And there was a photo of Ronaldo. And he was like celebrating like, yes, or something like that. He was on his knees. And I remember like we were taking photos with all of them. And I told my grandpa or my uncle, I don't know who I told, and said like, come take a picture with me here. And I kind of like imitated him. I did the same like celebration, And after that, he sent it to my mom and everything. And as the game was going on, she was sitting with an employee of UEFA. That's the Federation of Football for Europe.
Yeah.
And she was like, yeah, I have a son. I have two sons. And I have an older and a younger one. And he showed the picture of the older one, me, obviously. And I don't know, maybe she saved it or something like that. But the first picture she had was the picture that my grandpa or my uncle took of me. And he showed him, like, the picture. And he was like, wow. Like, when he saw the picture with me and Ronaldo, he was like, wow, can you send it to me? We want to use it for a campaign and everything. And my mom was like, oh, yeah, sure. And that's where the ball started rolling because after that, they posted that and many media companies caught wind of that in Macedonia. They wanted interviews. And yeah, I mean, the puzzle it started combining, I guess. It was God's path, I guess.
Yeah. Well, no, that's really interesting. That sounds like that's quite a cool story, actually. So throughout your life and your upbringing, what are your first memories of maybe dealing with unfair obstacles to aspects of daily life? And how did you feel when you experienced those?
Well, there are many obstacles in my way as a disabled person living in a country in Eastern Europe that is not really developed, that is not really accessible. It was tough. I mean, from the people aspects, I've not had many problems because they've always accepted me, my friends, the people I've worked with along on campaigns or many other things. I was always accepted by them. They looked at me as an individual, not as a guy in a wheelchair, you know. But in terms of obstacles, in terms of accessibility obstacles and something like that, there were many. I mean, when my elementary school, it was a 2-story building. It had stairs, and I couldn't go to the top floor. And yeah, I mean, that was kind of a nag that I had to deal with for 9 years. But thankfully, yeah, we were on the first floor. So yeah, when I'm in my home country, I carry my own ramps in a backpack. That looks kind of weird, but I mean, you're in the city center with ramps on your back. I mean, it's kind of weird for other people to see, but I mean, I have to because buses there are not accessible. They say they have ramps. I mean, they have ramps, but because the staff don't clean them, they're rarely cleaned. They stop working, and because they don't bother to clean them. And yeah, I've had experiences like that. I've had experiences where they were accessible buses, but like I've had an experience where the driver didn't want to open the ramp because I was like going 1 or 2 stations, as if that is his concern. Or I've had an experience that once he had to pull it, and I remember like it was yesterday. I'm sitting at the bus station, and the bus comes, and I tell the driver, "Can you open the ramp?" He looks at his phone, he's like points to the cabin, like go ask someone from there to open your ramp. But I say, "Sir, it's your job to do that." And he turns to me and says, "What? But what's my job?" And something like that. And he just yells at me, and I keep my cool. I don't want to argue with him. And he gets up like all angry and everything. And he grabs the handle as he pulls it because he was angry. He rips out the handle.
Oh, wow.
He tries to open it afterwards without a handle. He barely opened it, and I get up. And he's like, "So you're going to ask me when I come back on to open it again?" I mean, but I didn't say anything. And there was a kid next to me. And I was like, "Yo, can you open the ramp when we get off? I mean, I don't want that idiot to come back." And he said like, "Yeah, sure, don't worry about it." And the thing that day that angered me most was not the bus driver, but the people in the bus. You know, after that, I hear people behind me say, "Oh, you go to Germany and do that," or something like that. I didn't understand what was happening. They knew what was happening, but they didn't speak up. It's just, it's angering. But yeah.
I mean, that's a really upsetting experience. But it's interesting what you say about who it was you felt most anger at. It wasn't primarily the bus driver, even though he was clearly a very rude and inconsiderate person, to say the very, very least. But it's interesting to hear that you were upset at wider society in that moment, I guess it can be said.
Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier, of course, that cool story about Ronaldo in the football stadium and your family's efforts to raise awareness. I understand that you are a big football fan. What's your favourite team again?
Manchester United.
United? How do they do these days? I don't think they do quite so well, do they? Where are they in the Premier League?
Yeah, I mean, when I always say this, when I have a kid, he's gonna have to support United. So if he gets used to having highs and lows in life, he's gonna know that life is not just sunshine and rainbow. But yeah, I mean, yeah, they're not really great these days. Last season they were good, I guess. We reached 2 finals last season, but this season they are disgraceful.
I did support, when I was young, I did support Manchester United too, because I think it was the days of like David Beckham and so on, and like Ronaldo and Rooney.
I was born in the wrong generation. I was born for that part of United, not this one.
Well, the thing is, I only had a favourite Premier League team because, well, I grew up in Brighton, and Brighton didn't have a Premier League team in those days. So it was common for school children to have like a favourite Premier League team as well as a favourite home team. Now, of course, if you're a kid in Brighton, you don't really have that excuse. But yeah, I think Brighton did.
Nowadays you're good. Yeah.
Nowadays, good. More last season than this season.
What place did you finish? 7th last season? So yeah.
Yeah, I think it might have been 6th. I know we got into the new Conference Cup. But I don't think this year we're faring quite so well. I think it looks like the last time I checked, we're on the bottom half of the Premier League table. But anyway.
Yeah, you have a really good manager and deserve it, so yeah.
That's true. So how has football, by any chance, influenced your approach to advocacy? Do you think there are actually any lessons from football that are relevant to promoting the rights of people who live with disabilities and rare diseases?
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, I've done many campaigns for football related, and there are many factors that you can separate from football and use in your advocacy to be equal. I've done a campaign, an equal game with many footballers. I mean, that's also one of my one that's impacted the snowball I was talking about earlier.
Yeah.
Has it changed my approach to advocacy? Not much, I guess, because I play football, I love it. I mean, I played it with my friends when I was younger. Even nowadays, sometimes when I go back, when I play it with my friends, but rarely because I'm older now. But yeah, I mean, I used to play goalkeeper, and those were fun days, I guess. But has it changed my approach? Not really. I mean, you have those problems if you play football or you don't play. It's not a big deal. It doesn't change anything. But has it helped me with my approach to advocacy? Has it taught me some lessons? Yes. Equality, that we're all people, that we shouldn't judge a book by its cover, and we shouldn't separate people from other people because of something they can change,
And of course, alongside that campaign, like we've mentioned, you've also done lots of advocacy at the international level. And I believe it was around 5 years ago, you were at the United Nations and you addressed a number of leaders directly. What was that experience like? And what was your message? And do you feel that was well received?
Well, the experience in New York was, let's just say, an unforgettable one.
Okay.
Especially as a 10-year-old boy back then, because that was in 2019. No, I was 11, pardon me.
Oh, 11, yes.
Yeah, I was an 11-year-old kid speaking at the United Nations in New York. As you can imagine, it was a big event. I think that was a turning point in my career as an advocate, because you met so many big stars there. I met David Beckham there. So
oh, cool.
Yeah, and I think my message was well received, because it's not every day you see an 11-year-old kid in a wheelchair at the place where people speak, and on the stage, in the United Nations in New York, where presidents and prime ministers talk. It's not every day you see that, but yeah, I think I was really articulate. I knew what I was saying, even from a young age. I constructed my speech with a bit of help, because nowadays, I mean, then I needed help a bit. But nowadays, I just do it myself. I rarely ask for help because I know what I'm talking about. But yeah, that was a really fun experience. And I think my message was well received for those who wanted to receive it. So yeah.
No, that's good to hear. And out of curiosity, of course, sort of 5-6 years is quite a long time. If you were to give a similar speech today, whether it would be at the United Nations or maybe to a national government in North Macedonia or Slovenia, where I understand you've been living for a year, or maybe if you were speaking to policymakers in the EU, do you think your messages would be the same? What would you insist to them if you gave a speech to policymakers in today's world?
I mean, much hasn't changed from then, except that I've grown up. But most of that would be the same thing for policymakers to make the same things as I say now, for buildings to be accessible, for us to be accepted in society and not thrown out, I guess, not separated. The message hasn't changed a lot. It's the same message. Yes, as I grew up, I look at it maybe from this perspective, but the message is the same. And 5 years is really nothing. You can't change much in 5 years. I mean, the message is the same. Maybe something else I would add is, buildings to be accessible, as I said. I mean, when I look at my speech from 5 years ago, not really has changed not much. So yeah, same problem, same thing, just from different perspective, I might say. I just talk about other subjects also in today's world. So yeah.
I see. No, that's interesting. Obviously, you're very young. I know that you're at the time of speaking, you're 15 and soon to be 16 in late July. Do you feel like being young, and as an advocate, do you believe that being young is an advantage or a disadvantage? Do you feel like people are more or less likely to listen to you? What's your perspective on that?
Look, if you want to gather attention from people to listen to you, you have to know what you're speaking about. If I didn't know what I was speaking about, if I was a media machine or something like that, I would be nowhere. But I know what I'm talking about, and I know that, I have a lot to learn about. I'm not saying I have all the answers, I'm not a genie, but I have a lot of experience with which I can share. And I know a lot of things that I can share also that can benefit the world.
What would your advice be to maybe other young people who live with a rare disease or maybe a disability? What would be your advice to them if they are considering making a difference and maybe calling for greater justice and equity in their daily lives, whether in healthcare or in day-to-day life and in the way that they access various services in day-to-day life? What would be your advice to other young people who maybe are interested in advocating for people living with a rare disease or a related disability?
Just do it, I guess. Because many people I know with a disability back in my country, in Macedonia, are ashamed. Because when I go to countries like Sweden, Denmark, France, Germany, I see a lot of disabled people on the streets. When I go back home, I rarely see them. And it's not about the fact that they aren't there. They're just ashamed, and their families sometimes are ashamed of them. It is a really concerning and a disgusting thing to see in today's world, because you shouldn't be ashamed of yourself. You shouldn't be putting a sticker on your head which says I'm disabled and that's all that I am, But because my parents always told me I wasn't equal to everyone and I wasn't anything less because of my disability, I've advocated it and talked about these topics without feeling ashamed. So if you are an advocate and you want something to say and you want to see change in the world, you should definitely do it, and you shouldn't be ashamed of it. Doesn't matter if you're disabled, doesn't matter if you're blind or deaf or anything, frankly, at all. If there's something on your mind and if there's some changes you want to see in the world, and if you have that anger that I have from policymakers and people in today's world, just do it and don't feel ashamed of it. That's what I will tell this younger and next generation.
That's a really, really brilliant message. Thank you, Yanni. So, Yanni, if I may ask you a final question, if someone were born in North Macedonia or somewhere else in Europe today with spinal muscular atrophy, SMA, what would you hope that their life looks like? And what would you hope would be the response to someone living with SMA by both policymakers and general society?
Well, first of all, when you mention policymakers, you have to understand when a kid is born and has SMA, you have to catch it early. If you don't, there can be consequences after that. And for you to catch it early, you have to have neonatal screenings or some diseases. Like they test the child for the diseases. And SMA is not, I think in most countries, SMA is not added to that list of neonatal screening for diseases. And that's the thing, if it were added, and if a child was born with SMA, and you caught it that early, he could start immediately with therapy, and he can live a normal life. So first of all, I would want that. I advocate for that a lot, to have those screenings at birth. And in terms of society, I'd want them to be accepted. Like I was accepted in society by friends, by family, because some families, they aren't accepted, they think of something less. So yeah, accept them, never bully them, because I'm a resistant person. They can bully me, I can counter, but there are people that are not as resistant as me, and if you bully them about a thing that they can't change, it can have major consequences. So accept them for who they are. If everyone in my inner circle looked just at my disability and not further, I wouldn't have an inner circle. So don't look just at the wheelchair, look past it.
Thank you. No, those are really important messages, both for policymakers and wider society. It's interesting you make that point about neonatal screening. I believe it's also called newborn screening. And of course, Eurordis has actually been doing lots of research into this area in terms of the wider rare disease population's views on the topic. And there is a consensus on the need to expand the number of conditions that are screened for from birth and diagnosed at birth right across Europe and right across disease areas. So it's really great to hear you calling for that and the expansion of such programs for the purposes of diagnosing spinal muscular atrophy much earlier. Yanni, thank you so much for joining me for this discussion today. It's been really interesting.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and thank you for those who have came this far and listened this far.
No, thank you, Yanni. You have been listening to Rare on Air, a Eurordis Rare Diseases Europe podcast with me, Julien Poulain. Thank you for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe so you can tune in next month to learn more about the world of rare diseases. Do you have any reflections from today's episode that you would like to share? Feel free to email us at rareonair@eurordis.org. We look forward to you joining us next month.